Hello, hello, hello. And welcome. Everyone's coming in. Everyone's taking their seats. You know, while we have a moment, since we're here, can you raise your hand if you went to school here at NYU? Undergrad, grad, a class, or whatever? Okay, that's a lot of folks. Raise your hand if you have a friend or a family member or a child who went to NYU. More hands. Oh, a lot of hands. I see someone raise 2 hands. And for folks watching this later on the live stream, I saw one person in the back raised 2 hands and a foot. So I'm not sure exactly what that means. It's great to have everyone here to talk about this topic. I actually started out my day today on a EV bus, which is part of NYU's overall journey towards a fully electrified future. And we've done all we can for this conference. The lights are electric. This mic is electric, and there's actually a small electric charge in your seat. And if you mention Columbia, you will get a shock. So just everyone be ready for that during our conference. But no, seriously, NYU is very happy to host this, not only to do our part towards making the city a better place, but to host these discussions and these conversations with all of you who are doing the work and making the change. So welcome, and with that, I will turn things over to John.
Great, thank you, Cecil. Welcome, everybody. My name is John Mandyke. I'm the CEO of Urban Green. We're so thrilled to have you here today at our first in-person conference since 2019. For those of you that were here in 2019, you'll remember the fire alarm. Cleared the room. We spent 20 minutes in Washington Square Park, and thankfully everybody came back and we finished the conference, so that was great. In case of a fire alarm this year, we will listen for instructions from NYU officials. This is our 20th anniversary year at Urban Green. We're back, stronger than ever, and we're so thrilled that you joined us. You know, Urban Green has been the leading voice for electrification over the last 5 years with cutting-edge research, policy, and education. And today, this conference is about how we get beyond the electrifictions. We know there are many electrifictions, so let's talk about them. How many times have you heard, we shouldn't electrify because the grid is dirty and we won't save carbon? Well, we set the baseline 2 years ago with our Going Electric report, which found that even with today's dirty, higher carbon grid, we still save carbon through electrification because heat pumps are more efficient than the boilers they replace. How many times have you heard we shouldn't electrify because we're going to crash the grid? Well, last year we released Getting Grid Ready. Grid Ready found that there is plenty of room to electrify in New York City well before we need to do the planned upgrades that are necessary. In fact, there is a 42% difference in New York City between our summer peak and our winter peak, which means there is plenty of room to electrify and to start now. How many times have you heard we shouldn't electrify because the trades aren't ready? Well, as we speak, Urban Green is working with Local 1 plumbers to develop heat pump water heating training for installers. So look forward to that. And then finally, how many times have you heard we shouldn't electrify because there isn't the political will to act? Well, just last December, New York City became the largest city in the world to mandate all electric new construction for buildings, and I'm very proud to say it's based on the proposal developed by Urban Green. Yes, we still have plenty of challenges ahead of us too. Whether it's technology readiness, whether it's workforce transition, whether it's financing. But that's why we're all here. And the truth of the matter is, where there are barriers for electrification, we will continue to knock them down. We really have no choice because furnaces, boilers, and hot water heaters emit more carbon in New York City than anything else. They emit more carbon than all uses of electricity. They emit more carbon than all sources of transportation. They are our #1 source of carbon emissions. And that's why electrification must be our future. And we're so thrilled that you're here today to help move us closer to that. Now, events like these don't happen without generous sponsors that make them possible. So I want to thank Carrier Corporation as the lead sponsor today to make this event possible. Let's give Carrier a round of applause, please. I want to thank our reception sponsor, Highmark. Highmark is sponsoring the reception that will happen just across the hall at the end of the conference. Let's give them a big round of applause. And of course, I want to thank again Cecil and NYU as our host sponsor. They have donated this entire space and facility for us today. Let's give NYU a big round of applause. It's now my pleasure to introduce a very special guest who's going to offer framing remarks as we start our conference. We're really, really honored to be joined by Rit Agarwala, the Chief Climate Officer for the City of New York and the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. Rit is known to many of us as a tireless advocate for sustainability and one of the most innovative thinkers in this space. And we're super proud that he's an alum of the Urban Green Board of Directors. Please welcome Commissioner Agarwala.
Thank you, John, and thanks to all of you. Thanks, Cecil and NYU for hosting. Now that I'm standing up and it's safe, I also teach at Columbia, but you know, I'll get my shock later on. But I love NYU, and I could have raised my hand if it had gone in the other direction, Cecil's question, because my mother's an alum. So we all have our connections here at NYU, and the utmost respect for the fantastic greening work that this university under Cecil's leadership has done. And it is, of course, always a pleasure to be here with Urban Green Council. I can't claim that I was here at the first 20 years ago, but I know it's only 15 years ago that I was a regular participant and sometimes speaker at Urban Green conferences, and it is a tremendous thing what you, John, what Sabrina, what Russell Unger, who is here certainly somewhere, have built in an organization that is so important to what is, in fact, clearly as John said, the most important task facing sustainability in New York City, which is greening our building stock. And I'm grateful to all of you who are here and participating because I represent the policymaking group. And policy is really important. And our last 10 or 15 years on this topic have in many ways been driven by policies. By legislation, by plans coming out of City Hall, things like that. And those are very good, and they're very important, and I'm proud of my contribution to them. But at the end of the day, no report, no law directly takes carbon out of the atmosphere, right? And so the war on climate is going to be won co-op board by co-op board, building maintainer by building maintainer, asset manager by asset manager, and it'll be won window by window. And insulated pipe by insulated pipe, and yes, I hope, heat pump by heat pump. And so it is really the work that you all do that is what matters if we are going to actually put points on the board and stop the terrible process of global warming and climate weirding that we are facing. At the same time, as we try to work as quickly as we can to start addressing the sad reality that the climate is changing around us faster than we have the capability to react. And so unfortunately, we are in the middle of a two-front war. We have to decarbonize at the same time as we have to adapt, and that is very difficult. And so we need progress on all fronts. Given the fact that it is you all, not we, who are on the front lines, I'm here to say that the Adams administration is here to help. We want to do everything we possibly can to help this sector achieve the targets that have been set. Mayor Adams has been quite clear in stating and restating that this administration is firmly committed to all of the carbon targets and limits that have been set by law. We are doing everything we can to get Local Law 97 implemented and to achieve the targets that are set out for 2024. We are doing everything we can to achieve the city operations limits that were enacted into law for 2025 and for both of the 2030 targets. We know, because we have so much to do to green the city's operations, that this is not easy. And one of the things that I am pleased to point out about my own role within this administration is that the fact that I have both an overarching policy role and direct responsibility for a major operating agency that is the city's second largest in terms of agencies, in terms of carbon emissions, that we know that this is not about talk, this is about action. It is, as the mayor always says, about getting stuff done, and we're willing to face the reality of what it takes. I deal on a daily basis with the challenges of implementing a multi-billion-dollar capital plan, of dealing with procurement, of finding contractors, of addressing the supply chain issues and the inflation that we are all facing. So I know this firsthand as we work to address DEP's own challenges and DEP's own carbon emissions. So I know what it is to have to green a building. And that kind of perspective is going to inform everything we do when it comes to climate policy. The fact that we are fully committed to making the rapid progress that we have to make, but we are also going to do so fully with our eyes open about the difficulty of that challenge and the role that city government has to play. I'll say I know many of you played a role. We were very proud and full participants in the fight to achieve the first step in that, which was the approval earlier this year of the Tier 4 projects, which will significantly increase the supply of renewable power to New York City and make it not by any means a slam dunk, but we see that as having been a necessary but not sufficient first step towards realizing the objectives of Local Law 97. Without that kind of supply of clean power, of course, those targets become completely unattainable. We were very pleased with the kind of partnership we have with the state of New York, with Governor Hochul, with the Public Service Commission. It's been a fantastic partnership, and one of the things that gives me great optimism is the fact that for the first time in many of our memories, the city and the state are working closely together in a true partnership. I spent an hour and a half on the phone yesterday with the DEC leadership. We coordinate on a regular basis. We have an open line with NYSERDA. We have a level of partnership that I don't even remember from the Bloomberg administration. And I think that gives us, that should give us great optimism. It opens our freedom of action. So we know that we have more to do there. We know, as I have said, that the two Tier 4 projects are a floor, not a ceiling. And we will be working as hard as we can to further expand the supply of clean power, to think about what we can repower of the city's in-city plants, which of course both produce carbon emissions, but also local air pollution, which we have to address and get rid of, and we'll bring a lot of creativity to bear on that. We are also, of course, fully in the throes, as you know, of implementing Local Law 97. And I couldn't proceed further without acknowledging my dear colleague Gina Bokra, who is a hero in that effort, and I think actually deserves a round of applause from this group. And who has been tirelessly leading the advisory board and the working groups that have been assembled, and I know many of you in this audience have participated in those, and I'm very grateful for all the expertise that you are contributing to that. I'll say here what I've said in the past about our perspective on Local Law 97. Again, we are fully committed to implementing this law. We are also taking at its word the title of Local Law 97, which is the Climate Mobilization Act. This is a mobilization. We have got to get every large building that is short of its targets mobilized. Unfortunately, I believe that a lot of the discourse around this law over the last 2 years since its passage has been focused on penalties. And I'll say again what I've said in the past. We don't see this as the Climate Penalties Act. We see this as the Climate Mobilization Act. We will work to make use of what is in the law to allow New York City to exercise judgment where buildings are falling short of their targets while demonstrating good faith efforts to comply. I'll say that again. We will use what the law allows to provide assistance, and you might term it mercy, when it comes to fines to buildings that fall short, when they are demonstrating good faith efforts to comply. And I think it's really important because some have characterized that as a weakening of the law. It is not a weakening of the law. We are fully going to implement what the law says. Some have suggested that that's not enough and we need to be clearer. We need to postpone implementation. We need to do less. And we're not going to accept that either. We are working right now on guidance. We will be able to tell the building community what good faith entails from our perspective. But I'll give you a sense that waiting until November of 2023 to start doing work that has to be fully in place by January 1 of 2024, that is not going to be a good faith effort. Sitting and saying, well, I asked a guy who knows something about boilers and he says it'll cost $1 gazillion, and so there's nothing I can do, that is not a good faith effort. Complaining about how little money you have if you've just completed a significant renovation of your lobby, I'm not convinced that's a good faith effort, right? However, if you have a building that is far away from its targets, has genuine financial issues, a building that is struggling to manage its property because, let's face it, we know that there are lots of buildings out there, co-ops particularly, that struggle to maintain their property, we're going to see what we can do to help. As long as there is a clear commitment to progress, a clear commitment to the goals and objectives and targets of Local Law 97. And similarly, a plan that says, oh, well, we'll reduce by 0.5% a year for the rest of time, but never get to our target, I'm not sure that's a good faith effort either. We will work on getting these. We will have a clear set of guidance. But I will say one thing. It will all start with a phone call to the New York City Accelerator, which is a really important resource that the city has invested significant money in. And I don't believe a building that is unable to meet its targets and has not fully made use of the resources that the New York City Accelerator can provide, I don't believe that would be a building that at least would meet my personal definition of acting in good faith. I will also say, though, that as we go forward, we fully expect to find some other needs, whether that's for different kinds of financing solutions, different kinds of technical advice, different kinds of changes in rules and regulations, and we will be open to them. And that's where I come back to my point that we are approaching this like a group of people who have operating responsibility, who know what it is. And so as we learn what the real problems are with implementing this law, what the real problems are with doing the retrofits, what the real impediments are to doing the building electrification that must be the ultimate objective of almost all buildings plans in New York City. I personally, and we as an administration, will be very eager to think creatively. We will be very eager to not say, well, we've done everything we can, now it's your problem, but rather we will be very eager to say, let us see what we can do to solve that with you, as long as a building manager, a co-op board, an investor, whatever it is willing to think with us and work with us and meet us at least part of the way. As you all know, the mayor is keen on getting stuff done. He holds us accountable to that. He is also keen on making sure that all of our climate efforts create good, local, well-paying jobs, particularly focused on low-income New Yorkers. And so we see Local Law 97 and the overall effort to make our buildings energy efficient as a core part not only of our decarbonization strategy, but also of our economic development strategy, and that's reflected in the economic development agenda that the mayor released only about 6 weeks ago. All of that is to say that what you are here to talk about, what you all do every day, what Urban Green does every day, is absolutely critical. Over the medium term, as John said, we are going to have to electrify almost every building in the city. We are going to have to figure out how to use innovation to make it as cheap and as fast as possible. We at the city are going to be committed to doing everything we can to make it as easy as possible. You also may have seen a week and a half ago, the mayor announced a set of concepts including what we call zero carbon zoning, where we are going to be working very closely with the Department of City Planning to think about what aspects of the zoning resolution can be changed that will make it easier for building owners and managers to comply with Local Law 97, whether it makes it easier to put solar on your roof or put insulation on the outside, all of those things. We know there's a role for us to play to be flexible, and we will do that. But again, this is greening New York City's buildings is not something the city can do. It is not going to be done by a policy. It's going to be done by you, by your clients, by the buildings you live in, by the boards you serve on. And so we are here to be your allies. We will be a partner. We will have high expectations because the future of our city and the future of our planet are on the brink, and they are in our hands. And so we cannot shirk, we cannot fail. But we know that this is a team effort, and we will be eager to work with you towards the goal. Thank you, John. Thank you, Urban Green. Thanks all of you for the work you do. This is an important day. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Agarwala. That was a very inspiring start to this conference, and you will hear a lot of problems and solutions in this conference. I had a preview. Let's see. So Urban Green's values are excellence, inclusion, collaboration, and engagement, and we invite you to be mindful of these during the program. If you haven't already connected to Wi-Fi, you probably should, because cell service does not work that well in here, and we want you to engage with our question app. So to ask questions, you log into slido.com and enter the code UGC. It's the same system for all the sessions. We'll clear out the questions for each, during each panel. Ask questions as they come to you. What happens is folks ask questions right when the Q&A section starts, and then the moderator has to scramble to see, what all the questions are. So the sooner you ask questions, the more likely it is that that question will be asked. And finally, if you hear something interesting, please don't hesitate to share it on social media. We included our speakers' Twitter handles in the program. So without further ado, let me introduce our first panel. Oh, sorry. I'll just leave this up for a moment. So we call our first panel Electrifying the Energy Code, and it'll be moderated by Molly Dee-Ramasamy from JB&B, and it will feature Diana Burk from New Buildings Institute, Emily Hoffman, the Director of Energy Code Compliance with the New York City Buildings Department, and Chris Corcoran, who leads the codes team at NYSERDA. So come on up. We'll give them even more time to log in to the Wi-Fi. So actually, Diana, where's Diana? You're going to start us off. So I will introduce you. So let's see, let's get Molly over here. So for future sessions, the moderator will sit over here. So to get you in the codes mood, we have invited Diana Burk to kick us off with a brief presentation about NBI's Building Decarbonization Code, which is an overlay of the 2021 Energy Code, and she's going to explain all this to you. So Diana, it's all you, and you can either change slides here or use this.
Thank you. Sure. All right, I think I'm ready. So I feel so honored to be here today and grateful. I haven't been to an in-person conference in over 2 years, and it's just fabulous to be with you all. My name is Diana Burk, and I work at New Buildings Institute. We are a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, laser focused on getting our buildings to net zero carbon emissions. I'm on the policy team, so when we try and come up with policies to get our buildings to net zero carbon emissions, we believe we have to draw on a number of strategies. Obviously, energy efficiency is one of the most important strategies we have to employ because it's the most cost-effective way to get to net zero carbon emissions. We also have to think about how we power our buildings. Obviously, we want to power them from renewable energy, which is carbon emissions free. When we build our buildings, we also have to think about grid integration and storage techniques. So our buildings use that renewable energy when it is available, and our buildings do not contribute to the peak of the grid when our fossil fuel peaking power plants have to turn on. Finally, the reason we're here, we have to think about building electrification. So we stop burning fossil fuels in our buildings that emit carbon emissions. And then finally, we have to consider life cycle impacts like embodied carbon. Now, in our decarbonization code, we focused on 3 of these strategies: renewable energy, grid integration and storage, and of course, electrification. The decarbonization code is part of a larger toolkit, which is part of a nationwide partnership between NBI and the Natural Resources Defense Council. It includes 3 major pieces. First, technical resources, which is including our building decarbonization code, which is code language written to require buildings that are new to decarbonize. We are currently working on an overlay for existing buildings to get combustion equipment out of our existing buildings, and that will be released later this summer or early fall. Included in our toolkit are a few one-page fact sheets and a cost study, which I will talk about later in this presentation. And then finally, an advocacy framework. So what is an overlay? Why an overlay? Well, our decarbonization code is built as an overlay or suggested changes to 2 of the most commonly adopted energy codes across the country: the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code and ASHRAE 90.1 2019. We chose these 2 codes because they are the most recent codes which cities and states across our country are currently considering for adoption, and they are the most efficient codes to date. So we believe it provides that strong efficiency foundation. We also chose these codes because states and cities are familiar with the process of adopting these codes, and during those processes, they often consider amendments to change the requirements in these codes. So this overlay can be sort of a cheat sheet for how can we amend our state code to get to 0 carbon emissions. And then finally, we chose these 2 codes because they are also updated on a regular basis. Emily and I currently are on the committee to determine what the next IECC, the 2024 IECC, will look like, and I'll talk more about that later as well. So how is this overlay structured? Well, as I said, our current decarbonization code overlay is focused on new construction. It includes requirements for both residential and commercial buildings. And it includes 2 steps for jurisdictions, 2 choices. For jurisdictions that are not quite ready to require their new buildings to be all electric, we have language that would allow them to require their buildings to be electric ready. Still installing combustion equipment in their buildings, but at least having the electrical infrastructure in place. So if a building owner later down the line wants to replace their combustion equipment with electric equipment, they can do so without having to do a major retrofit. So for a heat pump, it includes requirements, for example, for a space and an outlet for a future heat pump water heater. The second step is for cities like New York City that are ready to require electrification, ready to require new buildings to be all electric. So we include code language for that as well. The key areas for electrification that we consider in these 2 codes include electrification readiness, or all electric requirements for heating, water heating, cooking, and lighting. As I said, we also include the 2 other strategies I mentioned at the beginning. We include requirements for renewable energy and storage, transportation electrification requirements, so EV readiness requirements, and finally, grid integration requirements. On renewable energy, we have sample language that jurisdictions can adopt that would require commercial buildings to install a nominal amount of solar on their buildings of about 0.25 watts per square foot. For residential buildings, the language would require those buildings to be solar ready. We also have energy storage readiness requirements for new construction for commercial only. For EVs, we have EV charging equipment, EV capable requirements or EV ready requirements for commercial buildings, depending on the occupancy type. A certain percentage of parking spaces either have to have EV chargers or be EV ready or EV capable. For residential construction, we require parking spaces to be EV ready, meaning there's an outlet for a level 2 charger for that house. And then finally, we include demand response requirements. So when we talk about demand response, we're mostly talking about making sure water heaters can be grid interactive and thermostats can be grid interactive. So we developed those requirements and released that code about a year ago. We released an update in August, and recently, a few months ago, we released a cost study that we conducted to determine how costly these requirements would be for a jurisdiction to adopt. We conducted this cost study in Climate Zone 5A, which is New York City's climate zone, so it's very relevant to New York City. We analyzed 2 types of buildings, single-family buildings and a medium office building. And we tried to figure out what the cost of the requirements would be for building an all-electric or an electric-ready building that met the requirements in our decarbonization code. For the single-family building, we also conducted energy modeling and did a life cycle cost analysis to determine what the cost impacts would be for homeowners if you were to require electrification or electric readiness. We examined the life cycle cost analysis using a range of utility rates, and because we were in Climate Zone 5A and New York City's in Climate Zone 5A, we looked at New York's utility rates and found there was a range of utility rates that you have in New York State. In New York City, for example, utility rates are on average 23 cents per kilowatt hour. In upstate New York, utility rates are around 18.6 cents per kilowatt hour. And then in both areas of New York, you can sign up for time of use rates, which actually overall reduces your electricity rate and is on average 13.6 cents per kilowatt hour. So we analyzed those 3 utility rates, and we also analyzed the carbon emissions of that single-family building. And we found that in New York State in particular, that all-electric single-family building did reduce carbon emissions drastically compared to a building built to the code that had combustion equipment. Over the lifetime of that building, assuming that New York State meets its renewable targets, that single-family building would reduce carbon emissions by 1/6 of that mixed-fuel home over the analysis period. So it's quite a big carbon emission reduction. We also, by the way, found that all-electric single-family home was less expensive to construct than a home with combustion equipment. And this can be a little surprising. Usually you think when you make codes more restrictive, it makes things more expensive, but in this case it did not. And that is because that the mixed fuel home that has that combustion equipment needs the natural gas piping, natural gas meters in the home, and when you remove that infrastructure in the home, it actually saves the construction cost quite a bit, between $7,500 and $8,200. It's cheaper to construct. We did not include the natural gas infrastructure outside of the plot line, so what the utility would construct, but we did consider the infrastructure within the plot line and within the building. When we analyzed the costs for an electric-ready home, of course, those costs did increase compared to the baseline home, but not substantially. It was only $1,000 to $1,800 more to construct a building that had outlets ready for your heat pump water heater, or your heat pump for space heating, or your EV-ready outlet for your electric vehicle, including the demand response and solar-ready requirements. So it was not that expensive. When we analyzed the life cycle cost over the analysis period, which was a 30-year analysis period, we found that the life cycle cost obviously depended on how much you were paying for electricity. If you were paying a typical or time of use rate, which was 18.6 cents per kilowatt hour or 13 cents per kilowatt hour, we found that over the analysis period, those homeowners saved money. around $850 to $16,000. If the homeowner was paying that higher fixed electricity rate, we did find that those homeowners did end up paying a little bit more over the analysis period, about $5,600 more. We also analyzed the cost impact for a medium office building. When we did that analysis, we found that the most costly requirement in our decarbonization code was the EV requirements. In our decarbonization code, we stated that office buildings had to install EV chargers in 20% of the parking spaces, and 40% of the parking spaces had to be EV capable, meaning there is electric infrastructure for them and conduit going to the parking space, but no wire or outlet. That cost for that medium office building was on the order of $10.70 per square foot, so it's quite substantial. If you don't include the electric vehicle readiness infrastructure requirements, the other costs for electrification were quite reasonable. The all-electric medium office building with renewables and man response requirements was only slightly more expensive to construct, around 33 cents to 50 cents per square foot. For the mixed fuel home or the mixed fuel building or the electric ready office building, those office buildings were, again, slightly more expensive than the all-electric building, but again, very reasonable. They're around $1 to $1.20 to $1.20 per square foot more expensive. NBI and Emily, we serve on the committee to try and see if we can get these requirements into the national model codes. So currently we're on the committee for the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code, which is adopted by many states across the country. And we introduced these requirements as proposals in October, and the committee has been considering them for adoption into the next version of the code. Here's a status of where we are. We're not quite through the process. The committee plans to release the draft code in August, and the final code won't be final for another 2 years. But so far, the full committee has passed electric-ready requirements for residential construction. They're voting today, actually, on electric-ready requirements for commercial construction. We believe that both the residential and the commercial code will have an optional appendix requiring all buildings to be all electric that jurisdictions can adopt. Both committees have passed EV charging requirements for residential and commercial. They have also commercial has passed mandatory renewable requirements for the next version of the code. It's at 0.75 watts per square foot for commercial buildings. That did not pass in residential, unfortunately. It failed last week, but we introduced solar readiness requirements, and we're hoping that will at least pass. The committee has considered and passed many demand response requirements and energy storage ready requirements for commercial. We're still waiting to see what the residential committee will decide. NBI has also been working with states and cities across the country to introduce our decarbonization code throughout the past year and a half. In Vermont is updating their code to the 2021 IECC and a little bit stronger, actually, and they're considering electric-ready requirements. We're working with Washington, D.C. right now, and their code development board just passed requirements to require all electric residential construction using our decarbonization code, and they're considering the same for commercial construction. Illinois is adopting a new stretch code. We're hopeful that some of our decarbonization code requirements will go into Illinois stretch code. Minnesota has passed mandatory renewables. Denver is moving towards electrification and is using many aspects of our decarbonization code in their new code. And Washington State and California are also adopting many of these requirements. And that brings us back to New York. So what is New York doing? Well, NYSERDA released a request for information for New York stretch code concepts, which made a reference to NBI's decarbonization code in the solicitation. And when they received comments, about 40% of the responses to the request for information were related to decarb overlay topics. So we believe New York versions of many of these measures are under consideration for New York Stretch and other state code applications. But I'll leave Chris and Emily to talk about that more. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Diana. That was great. Great overview. And thanks to everybody who's in the audience this afternoon for joining us. It's great to be here in person, enjoying each other's company to talk about some really important topics today. And so I think we're going to get right into it. We have plenty to cover here. I have some initial questions I'm going to ask our panel here, and then I'll actually reference the audience questions once we get through these initial, and we'll go from there. So to jump right in here, Diana, I want to start with you since you just gave that great presentation on the decarb code overlay. And you briefly touched on it, but I want to come back and just do a little bit more around what an overlay is and how jurisdictions might use an overlay in their typical code process.
Great. Is this on? Okay. So when states and jurisdictions adopt a code, they usually use some sort of process that involves a technical committee looking at the new code that they're adopting, and they usually involve some sort of process where they consider amendments to the code. And so sometimes the processes are public, and the public can submit amendments. And so we've done that. We've submitted these amendments to several states and cities across the country when they're adopting the latest code. And sometimes the process is funded by the state or city, similar to how NYSERDA adopts their code. And usually a technical group will develop a draft code and then release it for public comment. So it depends on the process, but usually states, I think the vast majority of states across the country adopt some version of the International Energy Conservation Code for residential and commercial buildings. Some states adopt ASHRAE 90.1 2019, and some states adopt ASHRAE 90.1 2019 by reference. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And Chris, I think you had a point on this topic as well that you just wanted to briefly touch on.
Just a quick point on that. If we wish that it was as easy as just in New York State as just taking the code and adopting it. Unfortunately, because of the underlying laws related to codes, it's more complicated than that. Of course, it always is. Because of that, what we've started to do is to look at, pulling it apart, figuring out where this, each piece can fit. Could it fit in energy code? Could it fit into other uniform codes? But this is one of those situations where I wish it was something we could just take straight and adopt for the state, but unfortunately not.
Understood. Yeah, thank you for that. And so to kind of go into the details of this particular set of recommendations and the decarb overlay, this concept of electric ready seems to be fairly present, right? This idea of maybe a two-step process to getting to electrification within new construction. Chris, I'm kind of curious to know from the NYSERDA, from the state perspective, this idea of electric ready, does it align with the definition that Diana put forth in her presentation?
Absolutely. We see electric ready as part of the continuum. This is a two-step process, and as we've seen, and I think we're seeing even in New York City, is that not every building is immediately ready to electrify, even in new construction. So we have an opportunity to put those buildings on a pathway, get them electric ready, get the conduit in the right places, plugs in the right places, make sure that when that equipment gets switched out in the future, it's easier, it's cheaper to do that because, again, you all know this, but it's much easier to do all of this when the walls are open, when a building's under construction, than it is to try to tear them out and do it at the end. So, that's definitely, we follow the same approach, and we see it really as a continuum. What we can do now with electric ready, and then what we want to do in the future with electric.
Great, thank you. So this electric ready two-step process, right? We've got some consistency amongst the code overlay, how the state is viewing this. I want to turn to New York City for a second, where we've kind of jumped past that initial electric-ready state, and we're going all in on this idea of new construction being fully electric. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Local Law 154, recently passed last year, which effectively is going to be phasing out fossil fuel-based systems in New York City in some typologies as early as 2024. And so I want to talk with Emily here for a second, specifically about how the city is preparing to go right to that fully electrified state.
Sure, thanks, Molly. I actually have a slide of all the different dates in Local Law 154. So just give us a minute. So Local Law 154, as you've heard of, many of the presenters have spoken about it already. It's requiring electrification in new construction. But within that law, there are several compliance dates. And these compliance dates reflect, when an application for new construction is submitted to the buildings department, when those have to be electric buildings. So you'll see the first compliance date here is January 1st, 2024. So if an application for new construction, or what we call in the buildings department an alt-CO, new building with existing elements, if one of those applications is filed with the department, on that date or later, it has to be all electric if it is a group R3 building. So this is 1 and 2 family homes. So that's only a year and a half from now. So 1 and 2 family homes, a year and a half from now, will be required to be all electric. Also, you see the second bullet, all other construction, so all other occupancies that are 7 stories and less, also will have to be all electric with the exception of surface water heating equipment. So the surface water heating equipment gets delayed until, if you jump ahead, that July 2nd, 2027. So it's about 5 years from now when surface water heating equipment, will have that compliance date. So if I look at this timeline, you'll see the second bullet is for the School Construction Authority. Their compliance date is December 31st, 2024. And then affordable housing is about a year later, December 31st, 2025. And then the big compliance date for basically all construction in New York City is July 2nd, 2027. So that's when all occupancies, so the building's 7 stories and greater, and all surface water heating equipment, that's when everything will be required to be all electric. And then with the exclusion of affordable housing 6 months later on December 31st. So, we see this progressive timeline. So while we're going all electric, we're also not going all electric for all buildings at the same time. And what's not shown on the screen that Chris touched on are the 2 code updates. So there's a code update that will happen, definitely before this compliance date shown on the screen, so sometime in 2023, where we're mandated to adopt the stretch code. I'm sure we'll get into that in later discussion. And then we have another code that we're required to adopt by law in 2025, a performance-based code. So these are both, another policy lever, I guess, where we can start maybe incorporating electric ready for these buildings that have a 5-year timeline from now, say. So, so we're working on that. Those are all the things that we're working on in place.
Great, thank you. That's a great overview. And I really appreciate the timeline here. I think it really kind of lays out the phasing of something like Local Law 154. So based on this, let's go back to Chris for a second here. New York City is taken on these really, sort of forward-thinking mandates. 154, of course, Local Law 97, which we heard quite a bit about earlier on. And there are a number of other initiatives out there at the city level. Can you tell us a little bit about how the state is thinking about building electrification in the short and long term? And as a follow-up, what we might expect from the state in terms of codes to support these goals and policy efforts?
Absolutely. So the state of New York is lagging a little bit behind New York City. New York City sets the precedent for the state, and we're fortunate to have the leadership here in the city. What the state's looking to do really is to advance energy code as quickly as possible. Just a couple weeks ago, we passed. There was a law that was passed that's going to require the energy code to advance faster than the model codes. So you're hearing about the development of 2024, other states adopting 2021. We are looking to help to drive that forward in the state. So we've been working for the last few years on developing stretch codes. We've developed Stretch 2020, which is in effect right now in New York City. We're working on Stretch 2023 as well. And again, that's something that we look to help drive a more efficient, the most efficient possible building in new construction. The one thing that that energy code is really good at is efficiency and the envelope. Really, when it comes down to it, energy code does that better than almost any lever that we have for new construction. And so really, it's really trying to push that forward as much as possible, and then look to other levers, other policies to help drive towards electrification. So I'm sure many of you out there have seen the Climate Action Council and some of the scoping plan work that's been publicized over the last 6 months to a year. Both the Climate Action Council as well as Governor Hochul have highlighted going electric as one of the most important things for buildings. There's in the Climate Action Council, the scoping plan has set out some dates similar to what New York City has. Obviously, this is draft at this point. We'll certainly look to see what it is when it comes out and it's finalized next year. But we do expect that at the state level, there's going to be some deadlines coming up in this next decade that say new construction has to be all electric before a certain date. Still to be determined and still in process. To your question, Molly, about existing buildings. Existing buildings, as I mentioned, it's a lot tougher with energy code. And the way that energy code is situated in the laws of New York State, again, it does a great job for new construction. We can do a lot and we can really move things forward. But we're going to have to look to other policies, other levers, other ways to drive efficiency and electrification in existing buildings. So, obviously, local laws is a great example of that for large buildings that New York City's passed. But there's also other ways to look at that as well. Things like appliance standards and looking at how those can be extended out across the state. So the answer is, it's kind of an bringing everything to bear, trying to figure out how to push in that direction. The final answer is going to be an efficient building that is electrified. The question is when that happens and how it happens. So if you want to future-proof your new construction now, go all electric and go efficient.
Thank you for that answer. I think that was super clear. And it sounds like if you want anybody to take anything away, it's that point, right? A highly efficient building, headed towards electrification sooner rather than later is the best way to future-proof.
That's exactly right.
So on that point, right, where I think there's probably pretty broad agreement that that's a good strategy, I want to talk a little bit about something that tends to be sticky, which is cost. And I want to commend Diana and the resources that have been put together as part of the decarb overlay, which include resources around cost. We saw that cost case study specifically around a single-family household and then a medium-sized building. There's not a lot of information just yet about cost, so those are really helpful metrics. I do notice, however, that here in New York City we have an abundance of large commercial buildings, and so I want to pose the question really to everybody here. How are we thinking about the cost to electrify large new construction and then to throw an extra little sticky bit in their existing buildings that are in the large commercial space? And I'll open it up to whoever would like to take that tricky question first.
So I'll jump in there. One thing I didn't mention about Local Law 154 is that 2 reports are required in that law. One of the reports is a heat pump feasibility study. And that report is, it's supposed to be conducted by the mayor's office. It's due next June, so just about a year from now. And what they're going to be looking at is the feasibility of different type of heat pump technologies in different building typologies, looking at that 7 stories and below, or below 7 stories and above, and looking at cost implementation and also cost of use. So I think we're going to get a lot of information. It'll be an information gathering exercise, and it'll be available publicly. So I think we'll get a lot more information out of that study that comes out in a year.
Fantastic.
Done. Okay. So we released the cost study a few months ago. We're actually hoping to expand it to other climate zones, possibly other building types as well. And I'm hoping also do the energy modeling and the life cycle cost analysis for those other building types. But we're looking for funding. So we find that funding, find a funder, we will do it. But it's something we want to do that we think can further electrification across the entire country.
Awesome.
And at the state level, whenever we put forward a proposal for a code update, especially an energy code update, we are always looking at cost. Part of our proposals, whenever we finalize them, will be cost effectiveness tests, looking at life cycle cost, looking at first cost, and really understanding that across building types, across climate zones, and across applications. So it'll be baked into the process, but and of course we really view it as an essential piece of the puzzle. Up till now, and actually still to this date, New York State has a 10-year payback threshold for anything in energy code. That is likely to change under the new legislation, really looking more at the life cycle cost. And so that's one of those pieces, I think, as we look ahead, that can really help with electrification, thinking about it across the whole life of the building instead of just putting it into a 10-year payback. Either way, that is all part of the process. It'll be public. It'll be is included in all of the regulatory filings, because we want to make sure that folks know what it is that we're getting into.
Yes, I think that information is going to be very important. It's very encouraging to hear from everybody on the panel here that they have that in mind, and that's going to be part of the information that's forthcoming. I guess sort of a last question that I've prepared here for everybody, and then we'll turn over to the questions that have been put forth by the audience here, is also about provisions in something like a decarb overlay that are tricky to fit into the New York City environment. I'm thinking specifically about renewables, right? That was identified as one of the primary sort of requirements that would hopefully be undertaken as part of the overlay. And so my last question is targeted toward Emily, but really anybody feel free to answer here. From the point of the Department of Buildings, how do you look at something like a decarb overlay that has something required renewable energy and kind of make it work within the context of the New York City environment where that's a harder thing to actually accomplish given the size of our buildings and available footprint?
That's a really good question, Molly. So I just want to touch on what New York City has already done in the legislation that we've passed that kind of goes in line with what Diana was talking about with the decarb code. So in part of the I'm trying to remember, I think it was part of the Climate Mobilization Act, Local Laws 92 and 94 passed requiring renewables or solar on rooftops. You can also install green roof, but the most cost-effective option is solar, and so that's what we're seeing. So that's required for all new roofs in New York City. That's single-family homes to skyscrapers. So that's already a requirement. We've had electric vehicle ready in the code for quite some time for commercial parking garages, parking lots. The 2020 Energy Code, which adopted the stretch code, also requires electric vehicle ready in residential homes. So that's been a requirement since 2020 as well. And one big component of the decarb code is energy efficiency. And we do have one of the most energy efficient codes in the country, and we'll be adopting the 2023 stretch code later, probably early next year. Timeline's still up in the air. But we're going to make very aggressive moves to energy efficiency on the new construction front. I think some of the things that we have to look at tackling still are energy storage and the grid controls. So I think it's really great that that's moving forward in the 2024 IECC process. And just to throw it out there that we will be modifying, we'll be having a call for our Energy Code Advisory Committee later this year. And so these are topics that we can look at and talk about incorporating into our code for next year, whether or not they come into stretch. All of this is under development right now. So I encourage all of you are the experts in the room, to join our Energy Code Advisory Committee and provide us your input on the best way to tackle this and get the decarb code into New York City, what makes sense now.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, I think from here, we've got some great questions in the queue, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump in, and whoever would like to take the lead on it, please feel free. Although I think this first one is probably pretty clearly for Emily. What tools does the DOB and the city need for the design community to be able to meet energy code and local law 97 requirements?
All right, so we have two separate things happening. We have the energy code and local law 97. So I think typically in the past, energy code is triggered when you're doing work in your building, right? And so, you easily follow the code. The tools that we're looking at for code, when we're going towards an aggressive code, is making sure that any new concepts that we have in the code, that we are explaining and educating to the design community clearly, and and clearly showing how you would demonstrate compliance on plans. So I realize this is not a very specific answer, but we're still under the code development, so it's a little bit, we can't be too specific until we know what the code is looking like. And then, as far as local law 97, I'm not sure that we're there yet, or if I can even speak to that at this moment. But I just want to point out that one of the things that we did to try to align the current code with what 97 is requiring is, if you're doing an energy model for compliance, we have built in there a local law 97 calculator. So it takes the performance usage and it converts it to carbon dioxide, and based on your occupancy in the building, the proposed occupancy categories, it calculates your limit. So you're able to see what the limit is and what your anticipated carbon emissions would be. So that's just something that we've done. So we've been forward thinking and collaborative, and and like I said, we do take suggestions from the design community, and when we have an advisory committee for energy code, I think it's really important to talk about enforcement and compliance and tools that are needed. We have a strong relationship with the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and they're the developers of ComCheck and ResCheck. We are implementing a pilot program with them to look how to implement our 2025 performance code. So lots of things are happening, lots of tools are under consideration. A lot of you have been engaged in our pilot program, so we really encourage the design community to participate in any sort of outreach that we're doing and programs that we have.
I would just second that, what Emily said. I mean, we really need your help as well to identify some of those tools and resources that are going to help us get there. The ComCheck, ResCheck, energy code trainings that Urban Green and others do. Other tools that are out there. That's almost table stakes. But we know there's going to need to be more as we have a more advanced code and we have and we move to performance-based codes. Let us know. Let us know what we can do to help, what resources we can build. Our stretch effort is going to include a committee that's actually working and identifying those tools and resources as well. But all suggestions are helpful.
This is sort of a follow-up question to that. If there are members here and in other circles that are interested in getting involved, right? How do they become involved? Is it looking specifically for communications from these different groups that are making these decisions, or can they go somewhere to see what opportunities are available?
I can I can specifically talk about what we do with Department of Buildings. We do when we're looking when we do a call for our committee participants. We'll do outreach from the department. We'll post on our website. We'll do kind of a mass mailing. We have sustainability newsletters. We have My Buildings newsletters. So read that coming forth. We have social media. If you follow DOB on Twitter, they'll be posting on that. So encourage you to just look at the outreach there, and yeah.
Great. Okay. So this is kind of an interesting question here. I think it's an interesting point, and hopefully we'll have some good discussion around it here. How do we make sure that electrified new construction buildings are doing the right thing, right? Let's say they're following the code, they're fully electrified. How do we make sure that they're actually more efficient and that they're working the way that we intend them to work through our codes.
All right, I'll jump in. So one of the things that we're looking at is in 2025, by Local Law 32, we're required to have a performance-based code. Performance-based is loosely defined, but it does say the code has to be based on a metric and a target. Metric and target are not defined as well either. However, if you think about a performance-based code, you're looking at what the outcome will be of all the systems in that building. So how we get there, that's how we're looking in the future. That's what these pilot programs are geared to. How can we develop these tools, so that we're not having a building with all electric resistance heating? That's not what we want to get to. We're thinking about that. We're looking at tools where, we're not maybe not requiring everybody to do a traditional energy model to determine what that performance is. I think it's really important that we need readily, going back to the tools, readily available tools, easier to use and easier to enforce, where we're getting the real outcome of really good buildings. So, and I think the code maybe needs a backstops in there. So,
I would agree on the backstops. I would say, further, we can push forward code, in theory, but it's really about how you all build and maintain the building in the end. So, trying to make sure that we have, sufficient compliance resources, for practitioners, as well as building officials. It's Department of Buildings here in New York City is a very different situation than the Department of Buildings in, say, Plattsburgh. Obviously, we're dealing with that across the state, but the levels of resources vary tremendously. So, looking at how, NYSERDA is looking at how we can help everyone across the board. Recently we've just launched some dynamic compliance checklists, for both the stretch code and the base code for the state, making it hopefully easier for practitioners to go through and make sure that they're complying with each part of the applicable code. We're also we've just launched a third-party compliance and inspection pilot for the rest of the state. So that we can help support these code officials who we know are swamped, who don't have time to always get to the energy code compliance, to make sure that it's actually at a basic minimum level hitting those performance as designed. So we've launched that across the state. We have municipalities that are already adopting it, and so we're looking to expand that further. The other thing that we are doing, and this is, it seems a little crazy to say this, but we're trying to help municipalities across the state get online with their permitting. So many building departments are still just totally paper-based, and so even just the basics of being able to get all of those departments online, make it easier for submissions, to make it easier to show where the process is, and what's missing, instead of just filing and sending it in and hoping it gets through the process. So all of those areas are kind of ways that NYSERDA and the state can help municipalities, mainly outside of New York City, to really grow their resources, help with compliance, and make sure that the building gets built right at the beginning.
I wanted to add a few more points. Yesterday, I was in a meeting for the IECC, and the Residential Energy Code Committee was considering a proposal that would outlaw electric resistance heating as the main source of heating in a residential building, and that subcommittee approved it. So I'm hopeful that through codes we can encourage people not to use the least efficient heating source and move to heat pumps. I would also say on the commercial code, the commercial committee approved a proposal by DOE that would require buildings to reach a certain number of points in the energy code, and that point structure incentivizes more efficient HVAC systems and envelopes and lighting systems. Because the code cannot, it's hard for the code to mandate more efficient systems, because the federal appliance standards say that states can adopt more efficient standards than that is adopted by the federal government. So that's one way the codes are kind of getting around that sort of federal preemption problem.
jumping in on federal preemption because it's one of my favorite topics.
Isn't it everybody's?
Yeah, of course. We're fortunate now that the current administration in Washington, has really taken appliance standards seriously. They just sat or went backwards for 4 years. Right now, the DOE in Washington is pushing forward 100 different actions on appliances this year alone, and they're planning on updating, I think, 60 different standards before the end of 2024. That's going to help us a lot. That brings that baseline that is where codes preempt us. It brings the baseline equipment up, and that's going to affect furnaces. It's going to affect heat pumps. It's going to affect rooftop units. This is something that is going to affect across the board. It's a niche area, but let me tell you, the impacts of that minimally compliant equipment are at the federal level are really dramatic, and I think will help us here in the state.
Great. I'm glad we got everybody in on that one, and it wasn't just focused on Emily there. So, good question. Shout out to whoever put that one forward. Here's another one that hopefully we can all kind of weigh in on here. In your view, what role do you think the utilities play, right, in sort of helping us as building professionals, as code professionals, actually move the building stock, both new and existing, toward an electrified future?
Happy to start on this one. The utilities have amazing programs around the state to incentivize more efficient, electrified, lower GHG emissions buildings. The heat pump, the Clean Heat New York program has been adopted statewide. It's driving adoption. Really, as you know, utility programs do a good job of providing that carrot, giving that incentive to go above and beyond. Take not just adopting the minimally compliant equipment. I would say also they do a great job on the existing building stock. That's the majority of what they're dealing with. So they can really help create a market and drive the market to improve its efficiency. Whether that's switching from standard water heaters to heat pump water heaters, or switching over to heat pumps more broadly. Really they can help make that jump with their incentives.
Any other thoughts, or shall we move on? All right. I think I have one that maybe you can start with here, Diana, and it's specifically about maybe future code overlays or thoughts on specifically embodied carbon, which I think you mentioned is included in what you currently have, and then also refrigerant management, right? To take that a little bit of a step further, everybody's talking about heat pumps, but there's a lot of movement right now about what to do with refrigerants and the role that they play in climate change.
I will take that question. So unfortunately, our current decarb code overlay does not include any embodied carbon requirements. It's focused on an overlay to the energy code. We are working on embodied carbon code requirements, actually. And unfortunately, it's not for refrigerants yet. We're working on embodied carbon code requirements for steel and concrete. And we're trying to get those into the International Building Code. We proposed that in March of this year. Unfortunately, that proposal failed. It was not adopted for the next version of the IBC. But we're getting lots of industry feedback. We're also proposing it in many states and cities across the country are starting to think about embodied carbon and are approaching us and wondering how they can regulate that better. So we are hoping to get some local adoption and some socialization of those concepts to get it into the national codes in the future. We are hoping to work on refrigerants soon, though.
With the embodied carbon issue, as Diana said, energy code is not a great place for it. It doesn't work well in the structure of the energy code. I think at the state level, we're looking to see where can it be deployed and what it makes the most sense in the short run, knowing that we're looking at a code update in the next 3 years. Obviously, the state and others have taken a lead on leading by example with things like concrete at the Port Authority and in other agencies. Those are kinds of things that we have New York emissions, there's a ton of concrete that's manufactured in the state. And we also know that we use a lot of it with our agencies. So, helping to drive it there, starting to create those markets so that, then once regulations come in later, there's a robust market already there to support it. On the refrigerant front, the one thing I would just note, one of the pieces of the legislation that just passed a couple weeks ago was allowing New York State to even start to deploy things like A2L refrigerants, things that have a slightly higher flammability, but are going to be essential when we start to shift to low global warming potential refrigerants. As of now, the New York State really can't require those, but now moving forward, once that legislation is signed, that's going to really open up a door for a lot of applications.
At the buildings department, we work closely with our other construction codes unit. So we're just in the early stages of looking at what those lower global warming potential refrigerants, how they would fit into the structure of codes allowing them.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's see, we got another good one here. As codes start to mandate EV chargers, and I think this also goes for other demand flexibility components here, how is the city, and I suppose this could be for the state too, but how are we dealing with the issue of standards and proprietary systems? And additionally, this kind of goes back to my question earlier about solar. Some of the challenges just associated with getting some of this stuff in buildings in a city like New York. Now that could refer to EV chargers specifically where street parking is a thing. Just curious, and Anonymous is also curious to know how we're dealing with those kinds of issues.
I think, when we're, so right now, the code just has EV capable, it doesn't require chargers. But once we start getting to requiring chargers, I think we just have to be mindful that we're not, that certain safety standards are in place and that we're not, preventing a hurdle for certain systems that maybe we haven't thought of, from being installed in buildings. So, that's kind of where we look at. We want to make sure that it's safe to be installed and, that either it's, if it's, a different, different technology or something on the forefront, that there's a means to come to the department for, approval if it's not specifically called out in the code. I hope that answered the question.
It sounded good to me. All right, let's see here. What else do we have here? Oh, here we go. Is there a concern that an electric-ready building may install under-oversized electrical infrastructure as technology changes so often? So I think this is actually a really good question. And I would argue that one of the things that I often hear as a service provider is I'm worried about installing something that will make my building electric-ready because what happens 10 years from now when everything changes? So maybe we could talk about that for a second, right? What do we say to folks who have that concern?
Off. So the technology for water heaters and HVAC systems is not advancing that quickly. That it's going to be completely different when a building might try to install new equipment. I mean, we have a climate emergency. We have to get to net zero carbon as a country by 2050. That's only in 30 years. We have the technologies in place. The electrical requirements of those technologies aren't going to change drastically. So our electric ready code, for example, it requires a space and condensate drain and an outlet for a future heat pump water heater. Heat pump water heaters are already out there. We know what they look like. We know they use a 240 volt outlet. They're not going to change. We're hoping future heat pump water heaters might use 120 volt outlets. That would be nice. But the ones currently on the market will continue to be available in the future. So I'm not personally concerned about that. I don't think it's going to be like hotels installing infrastructure for internet cables and then everything goes wireless. I don't think that's going to happen with heat pump water heaters and HVAC systems.
I agree on that point. I would say, I mean, so much of this is just no regrets strategies that, building the building the right way, putting in things so that we're ready to make even the most basic of jumps in the coming years is really, what we're trying to do with Electric Ready and a lot of these provisions. The other piece of the question, I think, is around, things like sizing and that. I mean, a lot of that goes back to, working with the market, educating the market, working with manufacturers, making sure that the folks on the ground that are installing these and maintaining these are putting in the right equipment at the front end, not oversizing, not undersizing, and giving them the tools to do it right. So figuring that out, how we can help them, really, pushing forward with consistent guidelines that can be deployed not only in New York State, but nationally, so that there are best practices to make sure that we're sizing equipment the right way now and also for the future.
Yeah, and I'll actually add a point to that too, just on the commercial side, right? These large buildings we do a lot of work in. Very similar principles for electric ready and preparing, right? Space, understanding the electrical infrastructure impacts and planning for those up front. It's a thing that providers are comfortable doing and can do as part of the process, future-proofing these buildings for an electrified future. So I think with that, we have time for maybe one more question here, and we'll close out. I'll give you guys a moment here to prepare, but the final question I'm going to ask after I ask one more here is, if there's one thing you want folks to take away from this session, what would you like it to be? But before that, I think this is a good final question from the audience. Case studies. Where are all the case studies for heat pumps? We hear so much about heat pumps and how they're the future. Where can we go to find solid case studies to give us a sense of how to implement these in the right way?
It's a great question, and the good news is we're seeing heat pumps deployed internationally across the world. Even in cold climates in Northern Europe, they are consistently deployed. We know that these work. We know that these work in New York in both cold climates and up at North Country, but also down here in New York City in Climate Zone 4. We've seen them working in Maine, where they're installing tens of thousands of them in homes. What we've also seen is on new construction, we're seeing the design really shift. If you look at our program, the Buildings of Excellence program, we're seeing new net zero energy, all electric buildings that are being designed and being commissioned and are in the market now, and the costs for them are marginal. So we have the case studies. We've seen a lot of work, and honestly, in some of these cases, we're behind many other countries in adopting this technology. So we can feel safe in making that jump.
Yeah, I think we'll start to see hopefully more case studies too as this starts to get deployed at scale here in New York, which is certainly where we're headed. Okay, so final question before we close out. What would you like everybody to leave here today with after this discussion?
As I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, Emily and I are on the committee for the 2024 IECC update, and that committee is releasing a draft code in August for public comment. So if you would like to be involved in commenting and reviewing the code language that has been incorporated into the draft version of the 2024 ICC, I would encourage you to get involved in that process. We need all the technical help we can get to make sure these requirements are feasible for new construction and existing buildings.
I've already mentioned this before, but if you are interested in becoming involved in codes, please join our advisory committee. We need expertise, and I think, one area that we really need to, focus on is existing building. Right, we have 97 that's looking at the operations, but that's 25,000 square feet and greater right now. We don't have a mechanism right now for the smaller buildings. So if you have ideas on what to put in the code and how to do that with case studies and maybe example projects that you've worked on, real costs, all that information is extremely valuable, and we 100% rely on your expertise and work. Thanks.
If you're looking to future-proof your building, and you want to make sure that regardless of what the codes and standards in New York State, City say, New York State say, down the road, 5-10 years, building the most efficient building possible that's electric is going to put you on that path. So all electric, most efficient, drive efficiency. That's the one thing that we know we can control now, and that we are 100% certain is going to always pay off in the end.
Great. So thank you again to our panel here, and I believe that's going to be it for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll let you guys exit stage left or right, whatever it is. Before we let you off for a break, we really want to recognize how grateful we are to our sponsors. And we'd like to specifically thank Carrier and close our first session with a brief message from them.
Confidence is at the heart of everything we do at Carrier. Our systems fill buildings and homes with healthy, clean air. We detect and put out fires and help people stay safe and secure inside. Our innovations keep foods and life-saving medicines cold and fresh until they reach those who need them. At Carrier, we create solutions to help you build a brighter future. Inspiring confidence. Carrier.
All right, so take a 10-minute break. There's coffee and snacks across the hall, and we'll see you in 10.